Hello, everyone, and welcome to lesson number 5 in our study of First Peter. In our previous lesson, I introduced to you the idea that Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27 permeates the book of First Peter. I have to tell you, this is an extremely exciting study to me. What I'm going to share with you in this lesson will not by any means exhaust the correlations between Daniel chapter 9, 24 and following that are to be found in First Peter. Now, admittedly, some of those, quote, echoes, unquote, to use Richard Hayes' terminology, are nothing more than echoes. They are not explicit citations. Peter never says, this has happened to fulfill Daniel chapter 9. I understand that. However, the themes and the motifs that Peter develops in First Peter, and by the way, really and honestly, we cannot exclude Second Peter from this discussion, as I'll take note here momentarily, because Second Peter chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, explicitly tells us that 2 Peter 3, or that 2 Peter, is a reiteration of what he taught in 1 Peter. So, if we find in 2 Peter references that are more explicitly related to Daniel chapter 9, then that informs us that 1 Peter likewise has Daniel in mind, even though 1 Peter and his references may be more implicit rather than explicit. I'll explain that more as I develop this. But consider this. If in fact 1 Peter is, as we have established in lesson number 1, if it is addressed to the diaspora, which obviously is undeniable, if it is addressed to the 10 northern tribes scattered abroad, and the language of 1 Peter informs us of that over and over and over again, because he cites, Peter does, the Old Testament prophecies of the restoration of the 10 northern tribes in the last days. Those Old Testament prophecies serve as the ground. They serve as the foundation. They serve as the spring from which First Peter flows. It is simply wrong to do, as the great majority of commentators do, to ignore that prophetic source and extrapolate and say, well, you know, what Peter is doing here, he is citing Old Testament prophecies of the restoration of Israel, but now he's changing the meaning radically and applying it to Gentiles who have come into the church. Gentiles to whom the promises were never made originally. That is to say, the restoration promises were to the 10 northern tribes. It is important to realize, of course, that when Israel, the 10 northern tribes, would be restored to the 2 southern tribes, then the nations, the pagans, would be called into the salvation of Israel. This is a critical point. Okay. So what I want to do in this lesson is to share with you this concept, this idea that Daniel 9, in fact, lies behind, serves as much of the thematic source for what Peter is saying. So to return to a point that I suggested a moment ago, if Peter is indeed writing to the 10 northern tribes, then the prophecy of Daniel 9 serves as a generic background. Now, I understand that Daniel was written in the context of the Babylonian captivity. But I also understand, and it's critical to understand, that the prophecies of the restoration of Judah and Jerusalem would encompass the restoration of the 10 northern tribes along with Judah and Jerusalem. Nothing could more powerfully suggest this than Ezekiel chapter 37. In Ezekiel chapter 37, we find first of all the prophecy of the valley of dry bones, which was a prediction of the return of Judah from Babylonian captivity. Oh, but wait, don't forget that right there in that same chapter is the prediction. What we find is the vision of the two sticks. And those two sticks represented both houses of Israel that would be brought together, and that was the restoration of, quote, all Israel. It would be the restoration of the diaspora to Judah and Benjamin. So when Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, is given the vision of the 490 weeks, the 70 weeks, which is for the consummative end of Israel's destiny, then of necessity it includes the salvation of the 10 northern tribes. And I want to share with you a book, brand new book at the time that I'm making the video. It is entitled Jew and Gentile Reconciled by my friend Brian Lewis. Now, Brian demonstrates that one of the most common errors in the commentators is to overlook the fact that the nations, unquote, the pagan nations, could not be saved until Israel, the 10 northern tribes, were reunited with the two northern tribes, or southern tribes, 10 northern, 2 southern, under Messiah. He points out that the 10 northern tribes had been so assimilated, had been so swallowed up by the nations, Hosea chapter 8, verse 8, that there is sometimes an intermingling, even in the language of Israel and the nations. Now, I would suggest to you that that is not true in every single passage that speaks of the nations, because right here in First Peter, we have reference to the diaspora who are dwelling in the nations. 1 Peter 2, verse 12. Very clearly, the nations are not Israel, and Israel is not the nations in this text, and there are others just like it. But Brian, nonetheless, does a great job of demonstrating that if we're going to take seriously the promises of the Messianic kingdom, that we cannot overlook the reality that that Messianic kingdom would be the restoration of all 12 tribes. And this is what Paul is dealing with in Romans chapter 9 through 11. And thus, Paul's reference to the salvation of, quote, all Israel is not a reference to every single individual. It's not a reference even to the majority of Jews. It is, in fact, the reuniting of the 2 tribes with the 10 tribes, i.e., all Israel. Just as Ezekiel chapter 37 foretold, this is Daniel chapter 9. This is the consummation of Israel's eschatological hope. Now, I say all of that to help us to realize that when Peter is talking to the diaspora, and he's talking about how they were receiving the goal of their faith, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 9, that we developed in the previous video, this is nothing but a statement that Israel's eschatological promises were in the process of being fulfilled. And what cannot be overlooked, very obviously, it would seem to me at least, those promises were not being fulfilled geopolitically. They were not being fulfilled ethnically in the sense that a specific ethnic people, to the exclusion of others, was being fulfilled, but rather God's promises to ethnic Israel, to be sure, were being fulfilled so that all nations could then come in. Once again, this is very, very critical. So I say all of that to help us to realize that while there may not be an explicit statement in First Peter, in which Peter says this happened that Daniel would be fulfilled, he nonetheless says that concerning the salvation that they were at that time receiving, but they were waiting for the consummation of that salvation at the coming of the Lord, he says, concerning which salvation the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, did search diligently to understand the manner and the time of the fulfillment of those things. Watch this, when they testified beforehand of the sufferings of Christ and the glory to follow. Now, as I pointed out in the previous video, many Old Testament prophecies foretold the suffering of Christ, which, by the way, is destructive to dispensationalism, as we pointed out. Psalms 2, Psalm 16, Psalms 22, Psalms 32, Isaiah 53. On and on and on it goes. The Old Testament foretold over and over again the suffering of Christ, which means since Christ died to purchase the church, Acts 20 verse 28, then when the Old Testament predicted the suffering of Christ, it was predicting the establishment of the church. You can't have the Old Testament predicting the sufferings of Christ, which was to purchase the church, without saying that the Old Testament predicted the establishment of the church, for which he died to purchase. Okay, now watch this. The Old Testament foretold the suffering of Christ and the glory to follow. Well, guess what? Daniel chapter 9 foretold the suffering of Christ as well as the glory to follow. And all of that was to be fulfilled within the confines of the 70 weeks. Look at Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, which in the countdown, and it's a Hebraic form of expression, after the 62 weeks, which is technically after the 69th, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. I'm reading from the New King James translation. Some try to say that he would be cut off and have nothing. No, that's really not the force. He would be cut off, but not for himself, is by far the better rendering. So, Peter says, the Old Testament prophets spoke of the suffering of Christ and the glory that would follow. Daniel chapter 9 foretold the suffering of Christ and the glory that would follow. That means, of necessity, we cannot exclude Daniel chapter 9 from our study of First Peter. Now, it means that we should include the other passages, to be sure. We cannot exclude them, and I'm not suggesting that. I am simply suggesting that when Peter said the Old Testament prophets foretold the suffering of Christ and the glory to follow, and when we go to Daniel chapter 9 and we read there of the suffering of Christ, and we likewise read of the glory that would follow, that we are on solid ground developing Peter's discussion of the glories to follow from Daniel chapter 9. And that means, pay very careful attention, if the glory to follow, the suffering of Christ, involves the Messianic kingdom, if it involves the Messianic temple, if it involves the salvation of their soul, if it involves the glory to be revealed at the coming of Christ in His, quote, second coming, unquote, if all of that has to do with the glory to follow, and if the glory to follow is related to Daniel's constituent elements listed in Daniel 9:24, which we're about to demonstrate they are, then that means that the second coming of Christ to bring in that glory to follow cannot be extrapolated beyond the 70 weeks of Daniel 9. Do you catch the power of that? I'm not simply trying to give that as a cliche. You know, my favorite saying. I am trying to emphasize how important it is to see that if the glory to follow that Peter has in mind is in fact related to the constituent elements of Daniel 9, verse 24, then the glory to follow of First Peter, which most assuredly is the salvation to come at the second coming, which most assuredly is the Messianic temple that was in the process of being built. It most assuredly is the everlasting righteousness of 2 Peter chapter 3. All of those things, if they are, since they are, the glory to follow of Daniel chapter 9, then let me reiterate, you cannot get the coming of Christ, the consummation of the salvation of their soul, the Messianic kingdom, the Messianic temple, and the bringing in of everlasting righteousness beyond the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9. But the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9 cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, be extrapolated beyond the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And that means the second coming of Christ, the arrival of the Messianic temple, the full glory of the Messianic kingdom, the new heaven and the new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 was fulfilled no later than AD 70. Now then, let's take a look at this. Daniel chapter 9 foretold 70 weeks are determined. They're cut out. God had determined that 70 weeks are determined to finish the transgression. Now, there's a great deal of controversy over this, but, pardon me, as I point out in my book, Seal Up Vision and Prophecy, as well as a fuller discussion in my book, 70 Weeks Are Determined for the Resurrection. There is very, very powerful evidence to suggest and to prove that this term, finish the transgression, meant 70 weeks are determined for Israel to fill the measure of her sin. And I want to tell you, this is powerful. By the way, Eusebius, 4th century church historian, who is called the father of church history. Now, look, I don't accept everything he says, but he cites others to the effect that finish the transgression meant that 70 weeks were determined for Israel to fill up the measure of her sin. Now, this is a perfectly legitimate Old Testament prophecy and concept. Isaiah chapter 65, 6 and following, foretold that in the days of the coming of the new heaven and new earth, Israel would fill up the measure of her sin. That's not the precise terminology, but as Young and Leupold and a host of other commentaries say, the concept of Isaiah 65, 6 and following is that Israel would fill the measure of her sin. Jesus most assuredly taught that Israel would fill up the measure of her sin by persecuting his followers in the first century. Matthew 23, 29 and following. Jesus said, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Behold, I send to you prophets, my wise men, scribes. Some of them you shall persecute and scourge, chase from city to city, that upon you may come all of the righteous blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth, from righteous Abel unto righteous Zechariah, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. So here is Jesus saying that Israel would fill up the measure of their sin in his generation. Daniel says 70 weeks were determined to fill up the measure of her sin before the fall of Jerusalem. Now watch this. In First Peter chapter 5, Peter says, be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks around as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, being steadfast in faith, knowing, now watch this, that the same suffering. We will have a lesson on 1 Peter and martyrdom. Wow, it's powerful. Knowing that the same sufferings are being experienced by your brethren or brotherhood in the world. Now, folks, it's very, very important to understand this. I am not personally satisfied, and many commentators, many scholars are not satisfied with that translation at all. The same sufferings are being experienced is a present active, but it's not simply experienced. That is not the concept. The Greek word that is there is epiteleo, and it means being filled up or being brought to their goal. Teleo is the Greek word for goal. Teleos is the word back in First Peter chapter 1, verse 9. They were receiving the goal. So the idea is that their brethren were being persecuted. That persecution was filling up and bringing to the goal the sufferings that were there. Well, what was the suffering? The eschatological filling up of the measure, number one, of Israel's sin. Number two, the filling up of the suffering of the saints. Now look, Paul said, and I'm going to turn there and read this because it's so very, very powerful. Do you remember what I just cited of Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, when he said that the Jews would fill up the measure of their sin in his generation, and judgment would fall in that generation? We'll watch what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 and following. For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God, which are in Judea in Christ Jesus. For you also suffer the same things from your own countrymen, just as they did from the Judeans, who killed both the Lord Jesus, their own prophets. They persecuted us. They do not please God, or contrary to all men, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles, that they might be saved, so as always to fill up the measure of their sin. So, we have Daniel predicting the filling up of Israel's sin within the 70 weeks. We have Jesus, and by the way, the 70 weeks ending in AD 70. We have Jesus saying that Israel would fill up the measure of her sin by persecuting his followers. Judgment would fall on that generation. Here is Paul speaking of the Jewish persecution of the saints, filling up the measure of their sin, and he says there in verse 16, that the wrath of God has come upon them to the uttermost. It means it's just about to fall on them. By the way, in Revelation chapter 17, the great city Babylon, which by the way is where the Lord was slain, had a cup full of the blood of the martyrs. And judgment was just about to fall. Well, here's First Peter saying that the diaspora saints, the 10 northern tribe saints who had accepted Jesus Christ, were being persecuted just like their brethren throughout the world, Greek word cosmos, and that suffering was working toward the goal, the filling up. This is Daniel 9 and verse 24. Well, not only that, and I really got to hurry here because time will run out. He says that 70 weeks were determined to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Well, over here in 1 Peter, what does Peter say? Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'm going to begin with verse 17 here. If you call on the Father, who without respect of person judges according to the works of every man, then spend the time of your sojourning. Now that's second Exodus language. Second Exodus language. His audience was considered to be in the second Exodus. Powerful stuff. Knowing that you were not redeemed, second Exodus language, with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. What was the sacrifice of Jesus for? Well, Hebrews 9:26 says it was to put away sin. What did Daniel 9:26 say? Or 24 say? 70 weeks are determined to put away sin. And oh, by the way, after the 69th week, Messiah shall be cut off. That's the Passover. That's the Passover reference of First Peter chapter 1. Daniel 9, Passover reference. First Peter 1, Passover reference. Daniel 9, 70 weeks are determined to put away sin. Christ appeared at the end of the age to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Do you see this powerful, powerful correlation here between Daniel 9 and 1 Peter? These are marvelous, wonderful connections. And by the way, what we have here is a reference, obviously, to Israel's festal calendar. I do not have the time in this lesson, and I'll be really honest with you, I don't know how fully I'm going to develop this concept of the festal calendar in 1 Peter. I'm still debating that issue. You'll just have to wait and see whether or not I develop that in a separate video. But the point of fact is, this is an undeniable reference in 1 Peter when Christ gave himself to redeem them from their vain conversation received by tradition from their fathers. That is the reference to the Passover lamb of the first Exodus. And now Christ, as the lamb slain, is the great Passover sacrifice. But you see, the Passover was the very first of Israel's festal calendar. And that meant that Jesus set in motion the climactic, eschatological fulfillment of Israel's festal calendar. The Passover sacrifice was the initiation of the fulfillment of the festal calendar. And that meant, you see, that last festival, i.e. Sukkot, the ingathering, the resurrection, could not be far off. Well, not only did Daniel predict 70 weeks are determined to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, but he said 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. As I suggested to you a few moments ago, since Peter explicitly tells us in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, that his second epistle is a reminder of the first, then we are fully justified to taking note that in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter says, according to his promise, we look for a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. What did Daniel 9 predict? 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now, unless a person is willing to say that Daniel predicted the arrival of everlasting righteousness, but that Peter is anticipating the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy to bring in another world of everlasting righteousness, then what Peter is anticipating is the complete fulfillment of Daniel 9. Now, is there any doubt whatsoever that Christ, quote, is our righteousness? 1 Corinthians chapter 1. No, there's not. Is there any doubt whatsoever that those who were entering Christ by faith in the first century were participating in that righteousness of Christ? No, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. However, even though the righteousness of Christ by faith had been initially established through the preaching of the gospel on Pentecost, they still had the hope of the arrival of everlasting righteousness. Paul said in Galatians 5 and verse 5, we through the Spirit do eagerly await the hope of righteousness. Well, where did Paul get his hope of the arrival of everlasting righteousness? Well, it could have been Isaiah 46:13, but Isaiah 46:13 is not different from Isaiah 51, where Isaiah foretold the passing away of the old covenant world and the establishment of the everlasting righteousness of Yahweh. Isaiah 51, 6 and following. But Isaiah's promise of everlasting righteousness in Isaiah 51 is not a different promise from Isaiah 65, which is the prediction of the passing away of the old covenant world of Israel in order to establish the new heaven and the new earth, which is the promise of 2 Peter chapter 3. Oh, but wait, the promise of Isaiah 65 and the promise of Isaiah 66 of the new heaven and new earth is not a different promise of a new creation, of an everlasting righteousness that is confined to the 70 weeks. They are not different promises. Where do you suppose Daniel got his idea that the time was coming of a world of everlasting righteousness? Do you suppose he might have gotten it from Isaiah? He knew of Isaiah. He certainly knew of Jeremiah, who wrote after Isaiah. So the perfect correlation in all of these verses lends us to believe, virtually demands that we see, that the everlasting righteousness, the world of everlasting righteousness of 2 Peter chapter 3 is the world of everlasting righteousness foretold by Daniel chapter 9. But what does that mean? Now watch this. Follow my argument very carefully. If it is the case that the new heaven and the new earth, where an everlasting righteousness would make its home, of 2 Peter chapter 3, is in fact the arrival of the world of everlasting righteousness of Daniel chapter 9, and if it is the case that the arrival of the everlasting world of righteousness of Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27, was to be confined to the 70 weeks ending no later than AD 70, then it must be the case that the arrival of the new heaven and the new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 was confined to the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9, ending no later than AD 70. You know, folks, it is absolutely incredible to read and to hear the desperation of commentators when attempting to deal with the beautiful harmony, the beautiful glory and unity of the eschatological narrative. I have mentioned to you before that in 2016, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, July 14th and 15th, in Ardmore, Oklahoma, I had a formal public debate with Dr. David Hester. David Hester made the following argument in his so-called affirmative speech. He said, Don Preston agrees that the church and the kingdom are the same thing. Don Preston agrees that the church, therefore the kingdom, was born on the day of Pentecost. Well, the kingdom, says David Hester, is also the new creation. That means that the new creation was born on Pentecost. But Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 was looking for the new heaven and new earth. Therefore, said David Hester, Peter must have been awaiting another new heaven and a new earth. Folks, that's a false contrast. That is a false either or. You see, Christ began a good work, the good work. Christ began the new creation on the day of Pentecost, so that Paul could say in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, if any man is in Christ, he is new creation. Well, in Philippians chapter 1 verse 6, that same apostle said, I am confident that the one who has begun a good work in you, that's the saints at Philippi, in whom God had begun the same identical good work that he had begun with the Corinthians. And he says, I am confident that the one who has begun a good work in you will complete it at the day of the Lord. Do you see the process of salvation? Do you see the already but the not yet of the new creation? Do you see how God had begun the Messianic temple and laid the foundation, which was Jesus Christ, that is to say, the chief cornerstone? The apostles and prophets were the chief cornerstones, or excuse me, the foundation, according to Ephesians chapter 2 and 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 21 and following, 27 and 28. We have a work in process. And all of this, folks, all of this is related to Daniel chapter 9. Let me reiterate my argument. If it is the case that the new heaven and the new earth to bring in everlasting righteousness of 2 Peter chapter 3 is the same promise of the new heaven and new earth, the world of righteousness of Daniel chapter 9, and if it is the case that the world of righteousness foretold of Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 is confined to the 70 weeks to be fulfilled no later than AD 70, then it must be the case that the new heaven and new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 to bring in everlasting righteousness was fulfilled no later than AD 70. Now, in my book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, I developed this with tons of exegetical support. So let me encourage you to go to my website, eschatology.org or bibleprophecy.com or even donkpreston.com and order the book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. It is the most in-depth exegesis, preterist exegesis of 2 Peter chapter 3 that you'll find anywhere, at least that I'm aware of. Okay, so here is Daniel chapter 9 that foretold the arrival of everlasting righteousness. But that's not all. And he said, Daniel chapter 9, to seal up vision and prophecy. What does that mean? Well, as I document with more documentation than you can hardly count in my book, Seal Up Vision and Prophecy, there is a virtual, almost universal. There are some dissenting voices. But there is a humongous consensus among the Hebrew scholars that seal up vision and prophecy means to bring the prophetic office to its termination, to its consummation, to its end through the fulfillment of all prophecy. Now, let me express it like this, okay? First Peter predicted the time of the resurrection. First Peter chapter 1, He has begotten us again unto a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, to an inheritance incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. Well, is that not the parousia? Is not the parousia the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy? I don't know of anyone that would deny that. Okay? So, Daniel chapter 9 predicted that all prophecy would be fulfilled by the time of the 70 weeks consummation. The 70 weeks would consummate in AD 70. Now watch this. Jesus in Luke 21 verse 22 predicting the fall of Jerusalem. Oh, wait a minute. Daniel 9:24 seal it, vision, and prophecy. The end of Daniel 9 is the fall of Jerusalem. Jesus, predicting the fall of Jerusalem, said in Luke 21, verse 22, these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. You see the perfect correlation? Not only that, in Revelation chapter 10 and verse 7, in the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet, and by the way, seventh trumpet is the last trumpet, which is the time of the resurrection, the last trumpet, 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and following. The last trumpet, i.e. the resurrection, is the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy. Everyone agrees with that. So Revelation chapter 10, verse 7 is the time of the seventh trumpet. Seventh trumpet, by the way, is the time of the resurrection. Revelation chapter 11, verse 15 and following. In the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet. What would happen in the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet? The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of His Christ, and He shall reign forever and ever. And the time of the dead has come, that they should be judged. And the time of the prophets, that they should be rewarded. Well, there you have it. Seventh trumpet, time of the resurrection. And that time of the resurrection is the time of the kingdom. It is the time of the new creation. It is the arrival of the new heaven and new earth of Revelation chapter 21. But you see, Revelation chapter 11, sounding of the seventh trumpet, is the resurrection. That's the time of the fulfillment of all prophecy. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, all prophecy would be fulfilled no later than AD 70. And oh, by the way, Revelation chapter 11, that time of the resurrection, that time of the sounding of the seventh trumpet, is the time of the judgment of the city, quote, where the Lord was slain, unquote. It is the time of the destruction of the city, pardon me, that was spiritually called Sodom, and the only city in all of the Bible that was ever spiritually designated as Sodom was Old Covenant Jerusalem. You see, once again, the beautiful harmony, the beautiful unity of the Bible in its eschatological narrative. Daniel chapter 9, 70 weeks are determined to fulfill all prophecy. Jesus said that in the fall of Jerusalem, in AD 70, all prophecy would be fulfilled. Revelation chapter 11, in the sounding of the seventh trumpet, the time of the resurrection, the time of the fall of Jerusalem. That would be the seventh trumpet, which is resurrection. Resurrection is at the last trumpet when all things would be fulfilled. But, pardon me, the resurrection of Revelation chapter 11, pardon me, just like the fulfilling of all things in Luke 21 verse 22, just like Daniel chapter 9, would be in the judgment and the destruction of the city where the Lord was slain. Perfect unity. Finally, Daniel chapter 9 predicted 70 weeks are determined to anoint the most holy. Now there's a lot of controversy about this. Is it talking about Jesus as the Holy One? Or is it talking about the anointing of the most holy place in the Messianic temple? I am inclined to believe, okay, I don't know that I can be dogmatic on this because the literature, kind of goes back and forth on this. I am inclined to believe at this point that the reference is to the consummated Messianic temple. And I believe that First Peter agrees with that. First Peter, as we have already seen, predicts the Messianic temple. First Peter chapter 2, verse 4 and following. Coming to him as a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also as living stones are being built up, a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And in verse 6 and following, he discusses Jesus, the chief cornerstone of what? The Messianic temple that was then being built up. I believe this is the Messianic temple. And there's another reference here in which this concept seems to agree. In First Peter chapter 4 and verse 14, the writer says, if you suffer, if you are reproached for the name of Christ, watch this, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and God rests upon you. Who are they? They are the spiritual temple. This is a reference to the Shekinah glory that abode with and in the Old Covenant glory temple when Israel was in harmony with God. So here is Peter talking about the Messianic temple, and he says if they were suffering for Christ, the glory of God abode with them. You know, that's pretty clearly a spiritual reference. There was not a literal physical cloud, the Shekinah glory cloud that rested on the 10 northern tribes scattered abroad. This is a metaphorical reference, but it is to the Messianic temple. Well, I got to tell you, I'm out of time. Okay, I'm completely out of time. I hope you can see that First Peter has powerful echoes of Daniel chapter 9 within it. Every constituent element of Daniel chapter 9 is found in First Peter. And what does that mean? Well, let me close by saying, if it is the case that Peter's discussion of eschatology in First Peter is based upon, drawn from, and inclusive of Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27, then that means that Peter's eschatological predictions in 1 Peter had to be fulfilled no later than AD 70. And we've got a ton more material to demonstrate the validity of that conclusion as we continue our study of 1 Peter.